Hi, I'm Dr. Neil Cox from the University of Reading, and this is the second in a series of three short talks about Seamus Heaney's Out the Bag. And if this is the first one you've seen, go back and watch the first one first. It'll make the whole thing make much more sense. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just offer in this a little reading, a little tentative reading of the end of the last stanza of the poem, kind of sort of go through it line by line and just think about it really. And I'm not making any kind of big claims by this. I'm just trying to indicate how you can really kind of think quite closely about this poem. It's kind of worth it. It's not an easy poem. It's a challenging poem, but it's also a poem that is worth the challenge, I think. And this is very much a sort of a beginning go at just thinking about it a little bit. Here's the last lines. The room I came from, and the rest of us all came from, stays pure reality, where I stand alone, standing the passage of time, and she's asleep, in sheets put on for the doctor, wedding presents that showed up again and again, bridal and usual and useful at births and deaths, me at the bedside, incubating for real, peering to her as she closes and opens her eyes, then lapses back into a faraway smile, whose precinct of vision I would enter every time to assist and be asked in that hoarsened whisper of triumph. And what do you think of the new wee baby the doctor bought us for us all when I was asleep? Let's think about those first lines. The room I came from, and the rest of us all came from, stays pure reality, where I stand alone, standing the passage of time, and she is asleep. Well, so this is about the room staying pure reality, so it was already pure reality. And I think in a very straightforward sense that means that the narrator is in a room that just is what it is. The rest of the poem has been moving kind of through time and through memory and is engaged childhood fantasy, but now we're there in the real of it in this room. Yet even that isn't straightforward, because this is the room I came from and the rest of us all came from. And there's a sense here that once again, as I was talking about in the last talk, the mother is elided or repressed here in some way. There's still a sense, even as this is about pure reality, that the children actually came from the room, which does kind of still tap into the fantasy about the doctor that the whole poem starts with recounting. The room I came from, the rest of us all came from, stays pure reality, if I stand alone. And that idea of a slight disappearance of the she, the mother, in this bit of the last bit, is also there with the idea that the narrator is standing alone. Well, obviously, in a straightforward manner, the narrator is standing alone. There's no one else standing. It's the standing that makes the narrator alone. But also, that idea about being alone is about a kind of ignoring of the fact that the mother is there. Now, she's asleep. And that suggests that sleep is a kind of a separation. Sleep is something that means the other in the room can be alone. Standing the passage of time, it kind of means, doesn't it, that just they're there in pure reality, marking the passage of time. Just really there in the moment, in the kind of the waiting. But it's also, I think, standing the passage of time, it's about counter to that, the idea that this is about memory in some way. That this whole sequence is about connecting to past times. So standing the passage of time can also be about the longer passage of time. And what does that... And that kind of throws up a certain kind of tension. And she's asleep in sheets put on for the doctor, wedding presents that showed up again and again, bridal and usual and useful of births and deaths. What I'm going to say about this, but again we could go into so much more detail here, but what I'm going to say here is that there's something going on with repetition at this stage, isn't it? The again and again. The repetition isn't always the same before the doctor, and it's not the same doctor. Yeah. But there's something here about repetition. This is about, in one sense, the passage of time, and the passage of time marked by those rituals, including the rituals of kind of birth and death. But repetition is what I'm getting there. Me at the bedside, incubating for real. So now we're kind of fixing back onto the me, the narrator, and the narrator's incubating for real. And here I'm picking up the kind of repetition of that idea of the real. Initially there's the idea that the room stays pure reality, as standing there alone marking the passage of time. But now there is a real that's about incubating for real. In the first of those, stays pure reality, as I said, it's about something that is untransformed. Yet ironically, that reality is still touched by the notion that this room in all its reality is the one that is the one from which children come in some way. That idea of a real incubation, that's something different. Although there's something kind of connected, because in both, my sense is that reality is touched by the figural. That somehow this thing that he's going through, the narrator's going through, we can guess, kind of just the feeling of being stationary and things slowly beginning and blossoming in a way. That kind of state of incubation is somehow real incubation. But actually this is tapping into other things from earlier in the poem. In the second kind of sequence, where the narrator is thinking back on illness and visiting Greece and thinking about a site in ancient Greece which is a site of healing, the narrator claims that that is a site of incubation, where incubation was technical and ritual, meaning sleep, when epiphany occurred and you met the God. So incubation has already been mentioned, and when incubation was initially mentioned, it was thought of not just in terms of ritual, so we've got that idea of ritual and repetition again perhaps, and also in terms of a meeting, and I might pick that up in a minute, but also crucially sleep. Incubating for real. Is that sleeping for real? In one sense, yes. And that means that even though the narrator is alone because the mother is sleeping and sleep marks the difference, the narrator is also really, really sleeping. Because in one sense, that's what incubating is. There is, as I said in the first video, a kind of a compression of meaning here. This is about, in one sense, the gulf between the living and the dying. The gulf of time, that wish for an epiphany of being together with someone you love, even as you realise there is this huge separating gulf. It's about those kind of distances, the distance in which grief happens. Yet even as it's producing those differences and those distances, it's also collapsing them. The sleep, in one sense, is being experienced on both sides by both people. Appearing at her as she closes and opens her eyes, then lapses back into a faraway smile. Appearing to her as she closes and opens her eyes. Well, we could say a lot about the narration here. It's a narration of the I doing the peering. Again, with the even though peering and his appearing to her are in some sense the opposite, aren't they? One of them is his peering, the other is his appearance to his mum. There's that repetition of sound that's kind of binding them together, and the appearing, the narration is here knowledgeable about how the narrator appears to the mother, and how the narrator appears is bound again, as I read it, to that notion of repetition. Appearing to her as she closes and opens her eyes. There's something about repetition going on here. And in one sense then lapses back into a faraway smile. He is about a repetition, because if it lapses back, it's happened already, it's repeating. But it's also working against that idea of repetition, because one of the things that's going on here is a kind of a structure of birth and death and ritual and repetition that's kind of linear and is moving forward and doesn't change, and it marks the passage of time. But in another sense, in this poem, is all about memory, it's all about going back, it's all about retrospection. And the lapsing back into a faraway smile is problematizing that notion of a forward momentum. Then lapses back into a faraway smile, whose precinct of vision I would enter every time to assist and be asked in a hoarsened whisper of triumph. Oh, it's very strange, you know. Precinct. I'm thinking here about the law. Is it about control? What it isn't is a seeing. It isn't about her looking at him. It's about him, if it's a him, entering a precinct of vision. I'm thinking here about the idea that, you know, that whole notion that out of the bag, as I was saying in the first talk, is somehow about revelation. Out of the bag is about taking it out of darkness, whatever it is, and showing it. It's about being seen, in some sense. It's about being revealed. Well, not really, because as I'm reading it, in this final scene, vision is a precinct of a smile. Vision is a precinct of a smile. That's worth thinking about in all of its strangeness. Because what is going on at the end of this, it's about entering that precinct. Entering vision as a precinct of a smile. It's about entering the precinct. The poem ends not out of the bag, but into the precinct. It's a going in, not a coming out. Or, if this is a coming out, if this is a revelation about love and death and birth and mothers and family and history and illness, then it's a revelation, a coming out, a making clear that is a going in. And that's a strange